I found my power lines cut by the HOA. Hours later, their lights died too. My home went dark after someone cut my power lines. But the HOA never expected an electrical engineer to uncover their hidden mistake and expose the truth. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The moment my entire house went silent, I knew something was wrong. But when I found the clean cut on my power line, I realized someone didn't just turn off my electricity. They crossed a line they could never uncross. I still remember the exact sound that woke me up that night. Not an alarm, not a phone call, just silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural when you know your home should be filled with familiar sounds. No refrigerator humming, no heating system running, no small electrical noises in the background. Everything had stopped. I opened my eyes and looked at the clock beside my bed. 11:43 p.m. For a few seconds, I thought it was just a normal outage. Maybe a storm had damaged a line. Maybe there was a problem somewhere in the neighborhood. But then I noticed something strange. The streetlights outside were still working. My neighbors' homes were glowing through their windows. Only my house was dark. I grabbed my flashlight and walked downstairs. The cold floor beneath my feet and the darkness surrounding me made the situation feel even more unusual. I checked the breaker panel. Everything looked normal. No tripped switches. No obvious electrical failure. That was the first moment I knew this wasn't a simple outage. My name is Ethan Whitaker, and before that night, I believed my biggest challenge as a homeowner would be maintenance, repairs, and the occasional disagreement with the HOA. I never imagined I would have to investigate why someone intentionally disconnected power from my property. I work as an electrical systems engineer, so I understand how power networks operate. I know the difference between a natural failure and a deliberate interruption. Systems leave clues. Equipment leaves evidence. And whoever did this made one mistake. They assumed nobody would understand what they had done. I stepped outside with my flashlight and followed the electrical line toward the side of my property. The night air was cold, and the smell of damp soil filled the yard after an earlier rain. As the beam of light moved across the ground, I saw it. A section of the line had been cut cleanly. Not damaged. Not broken by weather. Cut. The mark was precise. Intentional. I stood there for several seconds, staring at the damage. I wasn't angry yet. I was trying to understand. Because the question wasn't just who had done it. The bigger question was why. A few weeks earlier, I had started having disagreements with Victoria Reynolds, the president of Pine Ridge Estates HOA. She had concerns about my property upgrades, especially the electrical improvements I installed for backup protection. Victoria believed every change in the neighborhood needed HOA approval. I believed homeowners had rights over their own property. Our conversations had always been polite, but the message behind them was clear. She wanted control. I wanted independence. The last conversation we had before the outage stayed in my mind. Victoria stood near my driveway, looking at the exterior electrical equipment. Everything in this community has to follow HOA standards, she said. I asked a simple question. Does the HOA actually have authority over my private electrical system? She didn't answer directly. She just repeated that the HOA had responsibilities. At the time, I thought it was just another disagreement. Standing outside my dark house that night, looking at the cut line, I wondered if it had become something more. I went back inside and grabbed my camera, my tools, and my notebook. I didn't call anyone. I didn't make accusations. Not yet. I documented everything. The location, the damage, the time, the condition of the equipment. Because I had learned something throughout my career. The truth is usually hidden inside the details people overlook. And whoever cut my power had left behind details they never expected me to find. The strangest part about losing power that night wasn't the darkness. It was realizing someone wanted me to feel powerless. When I stood outside my house and saw the clean cut on my electrical line, I knew this wasn't a random failure. Someone had made a decision. Someone had crossed a boundary. And the more I investigated, the more I realized the problem started long before my house went dark. My name is Ethan Whitaker, and before Pine Ridge Estates became the center of a conflict between a homeowner and an HOA president, I was just someone who wanted a reliable home and a little independence. I purchased my property because I valued control over the things I worked hard to build. My career as an electrical systems engineer taught me something important. Every system has rules, and every rule has limits. Electricity doesn't simply disappear without a reason. Wires don't cut themselves. Equipment doesn't fail in perfect patterns by coincidence. There is always a cause. The morning after the outage, I started examining everything carefully. The sunlight revealed details I couldn't see in the darkness. The damaged section of cable was exactly where someone would access it from the outside. There were no signs of weather damage. No evidence of an accident. The cut was clean and deliberate. I photographed everything before touching anything. That habit came from years of working with complex electrical systems. Document first. Repair second. Understand the problem before changing the conditions. While reviewing my security cameras, I started looking backward through the footage. That was when I noticed something I had overlooked before. Victoria Reynolds had been paying unusual attention to my property for weeks. Victoria was the president of Pine Ridge Estates, HOA, and she had never hidden her belief that the HOA should have influence over every visible part of the neighborhood. At first, I thought she was simply strict. Many HOA presidents cared deeply about appearances and rules. But Victoria's approach was different. She didn't just want compliance. She wanted approval over decisions that belonged to homeowners. A few months earlier, I installed additional electrical equipment for backup protection during emergencies. I followed all required safety standards. The system was professionally installed, inspected, and designed to protect my home. But Victoria didn't see it that way. She saw it as something outside her control. I still remembered the conversation we had near my driveway. She looked at the equipment and crossed her arms. "Changes like this need to go through the HOA," she said. I asked her calmly, "Can you show me where the HOA has authority over my private electrical system?" She didn't provide a specific answer. Instead, she repeated the same phrase she often used. "We have responsibilities to maintain the community." That statement sounded reasonable until you looked closer. Responsibilities are not the same as ownership. Protecting a neighborhood does not mean controlling every homeowner's private decisions. After the power outage, I reviewed those conversations differently. I wondered if Victoria's frustration had turned into something more. I didn't want to assume. I didn't want to accuse someone without proof. But I also wasn't going to ignore what was right in front of me. I created a folder on my computer and started collecting everything connected to the situation. Emails from the HOA, previous notices, photos of my electrical system, security footage, maintenance records. I labeled everything by date and category, the same way I would organize a technical investigation, because I knew something important. If this was an accident, the evidence would show that. But if someone had intentionally interfered with my property, the evidence would show that too. And whoever made the decision to cut my power had no idea that I understood the system they were trying to manipulate. The first mistake Victoria Reynolds made was assuming I would react emotionally. She expected anger. She expected accusations. She expected me to walk into a confrontation without knowing the facts. What she didn't expect was that I would treat the situation exactly like I treated every technical problem in my career. I would investigate. I would collect evidence. And I would find the truth hidden inside the details. The morning after my power was cut, I began reviewing everything connected to the outage. I started with the obvious questions. Who had access to the area? Who knew about my electrical setup? Who would benefit from making my home lose power? The more I looked, the more the answers pointed toward the same person. Victoria had been watching my property long before the night my house went dark. She had questioned my upgrades. She had challenged my decisions. And she had made it clear that she believed the HOA should have control over things that were not theirs to control. A few weeks before the outage, Victoria sent me another HOA notice. The wording was polite, but the message behind it was obvious. She wanted me to remove my backup electrical equipment because she believed it changed the appearance of my home. I read the notice several times while sitting at my desk. There was no mention of safety violations, no mention of code issues, no technical concern, just the statement that it did not fit the HOA's preferred standards. That was when I realized the conflict was never really about the equipment. It was about authority. Victoria didn't like that I had something on my property she couldn't manage. After finding the cut power line, I reviewed my security footage from the days leading up to the outage. I watched hours of recordings, cars passing by, neighbors walking their dogs, normal activity throughout the community. Then I saw something that made me stop. Victoria's vehicle appeared near my property the evening before the outage. She didn't enter the frame for long, but the timing caught my attention. I didn't immediately assume she was responsible. A suspicion is not evidence. That was something I always reminded myself. In engineering, guessing can create dangerous mistakes. You don't repair a system based on assumptions. You diagnose the problem. So I continued looking. I checked the location of the damage again. I examined the cut marks carefully, the angle of the cut, the position of the line, the tools that could have been used. Everything suggested the person who did it understood the system. They knew exactly what they were targeting. That detail bothered me the most. This wasn't someone randomly damaging property. This was someone trying to send a message. They wanted me to feel dependent. They wanted me to believe they had control over my home. But they misunderstood something about me. I don't panic when systems fail. I analyze them. Over the next several days, I expanded my investigation. I requested copies of relevant HOA communications. I reviewed community maintenance records. I compared dates. I searched for any mention of electrical work or neighborhood access. Then I found something interesting. There were discussions inside the HOA about correcting unauthorized changes around the community. My property was mentioned more than once. Nothing directly admitted what happened, but the pattern was becoming clearer. Victoria had been trying to force compliance for months. The power outage was not an isolated event. It was another step in a larger effort to regain control. That night, I sat in my office surrounded by documents and photographs. The same room where I designed electrical systems for my job had become the place where I analyzed an attack on my own home. I looked at the evidence I had collected so far and realized something important. Whoever cut my power thought they were creating a problem I couldn't solve. They were wrong. They had created a system of evidence, and I knew exactly how to trace it. The moment I found the hidden connection between Victoria Reynolds and my power outage was the moment the situation stopped being a suspicion and became an investigation. Until then, I was still hoping there was another explanation. A mistake, a misunderstanding, a technical failure caused by something I hadn't noticed. But the evidence was slowly telling a different story, and the more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. I started by examining the HOA records related to my property. Pine Ridge Estates kept detailed documentation for everything they considered a community issue: landscaping complaints, exterior modifications, maintenance concerns. Every conversation had a paper trail that worked in Victoria's favor when she believed those records gave her authority. But it also worked against her when those same records revealed how often she focused on my home. I found several emails where Victoria mentioned my electrical upgrades. The wording was always careful. She never directly said she wanted them removed because she disliked them. Instead, she used phrases like community consistency and neighborhood appearance. Those words sounded harmless, but they avoided the real question. Did the HOA have the legal authority to interfere with my private electrical system? The answer was no. I knew that because I had researched the property documents, local regulations, and the responsibilities outlined by the HOA itself. The equipment on my property was installed properly. It met safety requirements. It was not damaging shared areas. Victoria simply didn't like that she couldn't control it. I continued reviewing security footage from the days before the outage. Then I noticed a pattern that made me pause. Victoria wasn't just passing by my house. She was observing it. On multiple occasions, her vehicle appeared near the area where the electrical connection was located. The timing wasn't enough to prove anything by itself, but combined with everything else, it became another piece of the puzzle. I printed the screenshots and placed them next to the photographs of the damaged line. I studied them the same way I would study a technical failure report. One piece alone doesn't always explain the entire problem. But when multiple pieces connect, the cause becomes visible. That was exactly what was happening. The next step was understanding how the damage was done. I examined the cut again and compared it with the type of equipment used in electrical maintenance. The cut was not random. Whoever did it understood where to access the line and how to interrupt power without creating a larger problem. They wanted my home without electricity, but they didn't want obvious destruction. They wanted control without leaving a scene that immediately looked suspicious. That detail told me something important. Whoever did this thought carefully about the action. They believed they were smarter than the person investigating it. They didn't know they had chosen the wrong person. I contacted a licensed electrical specialist to independently review my findings. I wanted confirmation from someone outside the situation. When the specialist inspected the damage, the conclusion was exactly what I expected. The failure did not appear accidental. The damage showed signs of intentional interference. Hearing that confirmed my next move. I wasn't dealing with an HOA disagreement anymore. I was dealing with a serious property issue. That evening, I sat in my office with the lights powered by a temporary backup system. The room was quiet, but my evidence folder was growing. Photos, reports, emails, video clips. Everything was organized. Everything had a place. Victoria believed cutting my power would make me feel helpless. She thought removing my control over electricity would force me to surrender. But she misunderstood the one thing that mattered most. Power does not come from a switch on the wall. Real power comes from knowing the system, understanding the rules, and having the patience to prove the truth. The turning point came when I stopped asking who could have cut my power and started asking why they believed they could get away with it. That question changed everything. Because whoever was behind the outage wasn't just trying to damage a wire. They were trying to send a message. They wanted me to understand that they could interfere with my home whenever they wanted. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated how much evidence a single action can leave behind. After confirming the damage was intentional, I began building a complete technical report. I treated my own property like a system failure investigation. Every detail mattered. The damaged cable, the location of the cut, the timing of the outage, the people who had access. Nothing was ignored. I created a timeline starting weeks before the power loss. That timeline showed something I couldn't overlook. Victoria Reynolds had increased her attention toward my property right before the incident. Her concerns always followed the same pattern. She questioned my upgrades. She referenced HOA authority. She suggested that my decisions affected the entire neighborhood. But every time I asked for specific rules or documentation, the answers became vague. Victoria was comfortable using the idea of HOA power. She was less comfortable explaining the actual limits of that power. I reviewed the community documents again, this time looking at them from a different perspective. I wasn't reading them as a homeowner trying to understand rules. I was reading them as someone investigating whether those rules had been abused. The language was clear. The HOA could maintain shared spaces. It could establish reasonable standards. It could address legitimate concerns. But it could not take control of private electrical systems or authorize unauthorized interference with a homeowner's property. That distinction became the foundation of my case. A few days later, I contacted the local utility provider to verify the history of the outage. I wanted official confirmation of what happened on their side of the system. The information matched what I had already discovered. There was no neighborhood failure. No widespread problem. The interruption was isolated to my property. That detail was important. It meant the issue was not a random event affecting everyone. Someone had targeted one location. Mine. I also reviewed the security footage more carefully, focusing on the hours before the outage. The cameras did not capture every angle, but they captured enough. I noticed activity near the service area before the power disappeared. It wasn't a complete answer yet, but it was another piece of evidence. The picture was becoming clearer. Victoria had spent months trying to convince me that the HOA had more control than it actually did. When I refused to give in, something changed. The conflict moved from paperwork to action. That realization bothered me because this was no longer about an argument over neighborhood appearance. This was about crossing a boundary that should never have been crossed. I decided not to confront Victoria directly. Not yet. A confrontation would only give her an opportunity to create another version of the story. Instead, I continued documenting everything. I saved every email. I organized every photograph. I stored every video clip. I prepared a report that anyone could understand, even without technical knowledge. The facts were simple. My power line was cut. The damage was intentional. The person responsible had access and a reason. As I finished organizing the evidence, I looked at the folder on my computer and realized something important. Victoria thought she had created a problem I couldn't solve. She believed turning off my lights would leave me in the dark. But she forgot one thing. Darkness only hides the truth from people who stop looking, and I had no intention of stopping. The moment I decided to involve professionals was the moment Victoria Reynolds lost the advantage she thought she had. Up until then, she believed this was just another disagreement between an HOA and a homeowner. She believed she could create pressure through rules, notices, and authority. What she didn't understand was that I was no longer trying to convince her. I was preparing to prove what happened. The first person I contacted was a licensed electrical specialist who had no connection to Pine Ridge Estates or the HOA. I wanted an independent evaluation, someone who would look at the damage without knowing the history between Victoria and me. When the specialist arrived, we walked around the property together. The morning air was cool, and the damaged section of line was still exactly as I had documented it. Every detail remained untouched. The specialist examined the cut, the surrounding area, and the access point. After several minutes of inspection, the conclusion was clear. The damage did not look like a natural failure. It showed signs of deliberate interference. Hearing those words confirmed what I already suspected, but it also changed the weight of the situation. This was no longer just a homeowner complaint. It was a documented property incident. I returned to my office and began organizing everything into a formal report. I created sections for each category of evidence. The first section contained photographs of the damaged power line. The second contained security footage and timestamps. The third included HOA communications and records connected to Victoria's previous concerns. The final section contained technical notes explaining why the damage could not be considered accidental. I wanted anyone reading the report to understand the story without needing to know me personally. Facts should explain themselves. While reviewing the documents one more time, I found an email from Victoria that made me stop. It was sent several days before the outage. In the message, she mentioned that unauthorized property modifications would be addressed. The wording seemed ordinary at first, but combined with everything else, it raised a serious question. How did she know my electrical setup was going to become an issue? And why did she describe it as something that needed to be addressed before any actual violation existed? I saved that email immediately. It became another important piece of the timeline. The more evidence I collected, the more obvious the pattern became. Victoria had been trying to gain control over something she never owned. When rules didn't work, pressure followed. When pressure didn't work, something else happened. I still didn't accuse her publicly. I knew better than that. A strong case is not built by making the loudest claim. It is built by presenting the strongest proof. I also contacted an attorney who specialized in property disputes. During our meeting, I placed the entire file on the table. The attorney reviewed everything carefully. There were no dramatic reactions, no immediate assumptions. Just questions. When did the outage happen? Who had access? What authority did the HOA actually have? What documents supported each claim? Those questions showed me exactly why preparation mattered. After reviewing the evidence, the attorney pointed out the same issue I had discovered. The HOA's authority had limits, and Victoria's actions appeared to cross those limits. The next step was clear. I needed to send a formal notice outlining the damages and requesting accountability. That night, I stood in my living room and looked at the lights powered by my temporary system. A few days earlier, those lights had been turned off by someone who wanted me to feel powerless. Now they represented something completely different. Preparation, knowledge, control. Victoria thought cutting my power would force me to surrender. She never realized she had given me the strongest thing I could have asked for. Proof. The day Victoria Reynolds realized she had underestimated me was the day she received the formal notice. Until that moment, she still believed this was a simple HOA disagreement that she could control with confidence and authority. She had spent months using words like community standards and neighborhood responsibility, as if they gave her unlimited power. But a position does not create authority where none exists, and a title does not erase evidence. I remember sitting at my desk before sending the notice, looking at the final report one more time. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of my computer running and the faint hum of my temporary power system. That sound reminded me of the first night when everything went dark. The difference was that I was no longer standing outside wondering what happened. I knew exactly what happened, and I had documented every step. The notice was not emotional. It did not contain accusations or threats. It simply explained the facts. The unauthorized interference with my electrical system. The documented damage. The evidence collected. the impact on my property, the request for accountability. Every statement was supported by records. Every claim had proof behind it. After sending the notice, I expected Victoria to respond quickly. She had always been quick to defend the HOA position whenever she believed someone challenged her authority. But this time, her response was different. The confidence in her messages was gone. Instead of demanding compliance, she requested a meeting. She wanted to discuss the situation privately. That alone told me something had changed. People who believe they are completely right rarely ask for private conversations after seeing evidence. They usually continue defending their position. Victoria wanted to understand what I had found. She wanted to know what information I had collected. But I didn't reveal everything immediately. I had learned that patience was just as important as preparation. A few days later, the HOA board scheduled a formal review. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, the same place where Victoria had spent years explaining rules to homeowners. The room was filled with residents, board members, and people who were curious about what had happened. Victoria arrived carrying the same confidence she always had. She walked in with her documents organized and her explanation prepared. She believed she could frame the situation as a misunderstanding. She believed she could make people focus on intentions instead of actions. When the meeting began, Victoria spoke first. She explained that the HOA was simply trying to protect community standards. She said the situation had been exaggerated and that her actions were misunderstood. I listened quietly. I waited, because I knew the difference between a story and evidence. When it was my turn, I placed the report on the table. I connected the laptop to the screen and began with the timeline. The first image showed the damaged power line. The second showed the location. The third showed the security footage from before the outage. Then came the HOA communications. The room became quieter with every document. Nobody interrupted. Nobody needed to. The evidence created its own explanation. Victoria tried to respond, but each explanation created another question. If the HOA had authority, where was the documentation? If this was a safety issue, why was there no official process? If the action was justified, why did the evidence show otherwise? For the first time, Victoria was not the person asking questions. She was the person answering them. And as I looked around the room, I realized something important. The power shift had already happened. The person who thought she could control the system was now being judged by it. The moment everyone in Pine Ridge Estates understood what had happened was not when the power went out. It was when they realized the person responsible had never expected anyone to challenge her. Victoria Reynolds had spent years building her reputation as someone who protected the neighborhood. She knew every rule. She knew every procedure. She knew exactly how to speak in a way that made her decisions sound reasonable. But during that HOA meeting, the same confidence that once gave her influence became the reason people started questioning her. After I presented the evidence, the room remained silent for several seconds. I could see people looking at the documents, then looking back at Victoria. The conversation had changed. This was no longer about an electrical system or a homeowner disagreement. It was about whether someone in a position of authority had crossed a line. Victoria tried to explain that her intentions were always about maintaining the community. She said she never wanted to cause problems and that everything she did was meant to protect property values. But intentions could not erase actions. The damaged power line was real. The timeline was real. The evidence was real. Then something happened that I didn't expect. Other homeowners started speaking. At first, only one person raised a concern. A neighbor mentioned receiving repeated warnings from Victoria about issues that were never clearly explained. Another homeowner described feeling pressured whenever they questioned HOA decisions. Slowly, the room changed from a meeting about my situation into a discussion about a larger pattern. I listened quietly as people shared their experiences. Because that was the moment I realized this was never only about my power line. My situation was simply the first time someone had gathered enough evidence to challenge what had been happening. Victoria had relied on people staying silent. She relied on homeowners believing that fighting the HOA was too difficult. But silence only works when nobody is willing to speak. The board members began reviewing the documents more carefully. They examined the emails, the technical report, and the timeline I had prepared. Each piece connected to the next. The questions that followed became harder for Victoria to answer. If the HOA believed my electrical system was a concern, where was the proper notice? Where was the inspection? Where was the documented process? And if nobody had permission to interfere with my power line, who authorized the action? Those questions changed the atmosphere completely. Victoria was no longer explaining rules. She was explaining decisions. The same authority she used to pressure homeowners was now being examined by the people responsible for overseeing her. After the meeting, the board announced that a formal investigation would continue. They requested additional records and began reviewing whether Victoria had exceeded her responsibilities as HOA president. Walking out of the clubhouse that evening, I noticed something different about the neighborhood. The houses looked the same. The streets were the same. But the feeling had changed. People who once avoided conflict were finally having conversations. They were realizing that community rules were supposed to protect residents, not intimidate them. A few days later, I received another message from Victoria. It was shorter than her previous communications. The confident tone was gone. She wanted to discuss a resolution. She wanted to move forward. I read the message carefully before responding. Months earlier, I would have felt frustrated. I would have wanted an apology. I would have wanted her to admit she was wrong. But by then, I understood something more important. Accountability does not come from forcing someone to admit defeat. It comes from creating a record that cannot be ignored. The evidence had already done its job. Victoria thought cutting my power would make me dependent on her authority. Instead, it revealed the limits of that authority. She thought she was controlling the system. She never realized the system was about to expose her. The final outcome was not the apology I expected from Victoria Reynolds. It was something much more important. It was proof that no position, no title, and no set of community rules could give someone unlimited power over another person's property. After the HOA investigation was completed, the board reached its decision. The evidence showed that the situation had gone far beyond a simple disagreement. The interference with my electrical system was not an authorized HOA action. The process that Victoria claimed to protect had been ignored by the person responsible for enforcing it. Victoria was removed from her position as HOA president after the board review and homeowner vote. But losing the title was only one part of the consequence. The bigger change was that people in Pine Ridge Estates no longer viewed authority the same way. They started asking questions. They started reviewing decisions. They started understanding that a community works best when rules protect people instead of controlling them. A few weeks later, I stood outside my house at night and looked at the lights shining through the windows. It was a simple moment, but it meant more than I expected. The same house that had gone completely dark was now filled with light again. The same electrical system someone tried to use against me had become the reason the truth was revealed. I thought back to the first night when I discovered the cut line. I remembered standing in the darkness, holding my flashlight, wondering who would do something like that. At that moment, I felt like someone had taken control away from me. But looking back, I realized they had done the opposite. They had given me the evidence I needed to take control back. Throughout this entire experience, I learned something that stayed with me. People who misuse authority often depend on others reacting with frustration. They expect anger. They expect emotional decisions. They expect people to give up because the process feels too complicated. But patience changes everything. When you document the facts, understand the rules, and refuse to be intimidated, even the strongest appearance of power can disappear. Victoria had a position. She had influence. She had years of experience making homeowners feel like challenging her was impossible. But she never had the one thing that mattered most. She never had the truth on her side. The cut power line became more than just damage to my property. It became the beginning of a lesson for the entire community. A reminder that responsibility and control are not the same thing. A reminder that homeowners deserve respect. A reminder that systems created to serve people should never become tools for personal authority. Today, my house still stands exactly where it always has. The fence remains. The electrical system works. The lights turn on every evening. But something else changed too. The neighborhood became more aware. People became more willing to speak. And everyone learned that silence only protects those who misuse power. Looking back, I don't consider this story a victory because someone lost a title. I consider it a victory because a boundary was restored. My property was respected. The rules were followed. The truth was recognized. Victoria thought she could cut my power and leave me helpless. She never understood that the strongest source of power was never the electricity running through my home. It was knowledge, preparation, and the courage to stand up when something was wrong. Because in the end, Justice does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, one piece of evidence at a time.